Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast. Now, according to Chainanalysis, over $2 billion in cryptocurrency has been stolen in cross-chain bridge attacks this year. Exacerbated by another string of bridge attacks over the last few months, many are calling into question the technology's ability to adequately secure users' assets and enable that interoperable multi-chain future that is needed to propel the DeFi industry forward. So many are arguing that protocols are struggling to strike that delicate balance between decentralization adherence and the pursuit of that ultimate priority for a financial product. Of course, I'm talking about security. So today I've invited Christopher Goes, co-founder of Anoma, onto the podcast. And for those of you that are just hearing about it for the first time, it is a intent-centric, privacy-preserving protocol that I want to learn a little bit more about. So he's going to join me on the podcast today, and I think we're going to talk about everything from the need for full decentralization in blockchain, privacy as a public good enabled by blockchain, and also tackle that thorny subject of why anonymity in money is so important. And he's also a renowned blockchain architect, and prior to funding Anoma, he led the design and development of the Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, IBC, which is an industry-formative alternative to bridges. But before we start today's interview, I just wanted to give a quick mention to our sponsors, because this month the podcast is brought to you by Flipper, which is the #1 marketplace to buy and sell online businesses and startups. So, do you run your own online business? And have you ever considered selling your website, your store, your tech, or your app? Because with world-class combined matching technology, dedicated brokers, and end-to-end services, all at the most efficient price, Flipper is making it simple to sell your online business. So to get a free valuation, visit my friends at flipper.com/techtalks, where each month thousands of online business owners exit with Flipper. Again, visit flipper.com/techtalks. But enough waffling from me. It's time for Get Him on the podcast now. So buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, I'm going to beam your ears to Berlin, where you can join me and Christopher in conversation today. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure thing. Thank you for having me. I'm Christopher, currently joining you from Oregon, usually based in Europe, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Anoma project, and also Nomada, which is part of that. And Anoma is it's a protocol for counterparty discovery and settlement. So what blockchains typically deal with is just settlement, that you have already agreed with someone on what you want to do. Maybe you're just sending money. Maybe you've agreed on a trade and you want to settle that on a ledger. That's important. But Anoma also tries to consider the problem of counterparty discovery, of how do you discover these people with whom you might want to interact, particularly in a sort of economic fashion where you're exchanging something. And we've tried to build this protocol to make a sort of general programmatic stack for counterparty discovery as well as settlement. Then Nomada is this early, so part of Anoma's sort of philosophy is that we want all of these systems of coordination, and we want to create systems of coordination which people can use, which are private, because sort of we think it's very important for people to have choice over what happens with their personal. But it takes a long time to build all of the cryptography that's prerequisite for making these like complex stacks private, and to build the compilers that will target private, like zero-knowledge proof compatible circuits. So we're also launching a project called Nomada, which is a standalone blockchain that just does private multi-asset transfers. The idea being to, not necessarily change the economic structure of payments as they are, but simply to provide a settlement backend, which is very cheap and which has strong protections for individual information and metadata on payments, instead of having your payments be surveilled by PayPal or the government or whomever. If you use Nomada, the information remains private to you and whoever you're paying. So it has the same privacy properties as cash.
And I'm looking forward to finding a lot more about Anoma and the problems that you guys are solving in a few moments. But before we do, I always like to take my guests back in time for a moment. Can you remember where your passion for tech came from, or that moment that would put you on the path that you're on today? Because you've mentioned you're in the US at the moment, traditionally you're in Europe. So I feel there's somewhat of an origin story here. So can you remember what put you on this path?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there are many points, not necessarily just one, but one,
Yeah.
since I'm in Oregon, one formative experience here was participation in at the time, it was a first tech challenge team in the US first robotics competition program in high school, which was really interesting and got me to start thinking about control theory and how do you design kind of intelligent systems which mediate interaction. How do you make decisions partially autonomously but with some human input, which I think, I mean, back then it was very simple, interpret controller actions and move the wheels of the robot. But in some sense, crypto economic design or blockchain systems design is also a question of designing like a control mechanism, right? That we're using this sort of system of economic representation to interface with the world, and we want to sometimes give feedback into the system to change how it's mediating our interactions. So I think you could draw a line there. I decided to move from robotics and more abstract conceptual engineering because robots have a lot of mechanical problems and I just got tired of it. But I do miss the tangible physical things sometimes. All these protocols are just, they're abstract. You can't point to them. You can't touch them. You can kind of gesture in language towards what you're talking about. You can describe it in writing. You can write it down in code. But they're sort of they're invisible in some sense. I do miss the robots sometimes.
Love that. What a great story. And of course, that path would eventually lead you to Anoma, which is an intent-centric privacy-preserving protocol for decentralized counterparty discovery, solving, and multi-chain atomic settlement. And obviously, those words will baffle the hell out of a lot of people listening, a little bit intimidated by this space. And one of the things I always try and do is demystify this particular space and put it in a language that anyone can understand and understand the value. So on that side of things, can you just expand on what you said a few moments ago, and also maybe some of the problems that you solve for your customers and the kind of value that it offers?
Right. So first, let me explain a bit what we mean by intent-centric. That
Yeah.
might be a new term. So I guess one of our realizations in working on this kind of technology, blockchain technology or distributed systems, cryptography, all these sort of technical research subfields, is that we really want to be able to adopt two perspectives at once. We want to be able to adopt the perspective of us, the system designer. I mean, that one's pretty easy. We see the technology, we know how it works, we're designing it, we're thinking about it, we kind of know that language. But we also want to adopt the perspective of the user. And, as much as we might love cryptography or distributed systems, or as much as we might enjoy talking all day about our latest protocol designs and how they work, yeah, we've come to realize that users don't, they don't care, or, they may care, but in the context of using a system day to day, when you go and swipe your credit card, when you go and, pay somebody in cash, when you go and, try and execute a trade, you want the system to work, as in you care about how it looks to you. You start with some state, you perform some interaction, you decide to do some kind of economic action, and then you take a look at the state of the system again, and you want to make sure that it did what you wanted it to. So how we try and design a language for users interacting with the system is based on that perspective instead of being based on our perspective, which leads us to this concept of the intent. And an intent is a way for a user to specify what it is that they want the system to do, right? So instead of needing to worry about how the blockchain executes transactions, because that's kind of a technical detail, users, when they craft intents, must describe what it is that they want. They have some apples and they want to trade them for potatoes. They want to pay 5 to Bob and Charlie. They want to do this thing, right? And the system is responsible for either satisfying those preferences or doing nothing at all. So we try to provide this kind of intent safety to users, such that when they clearly specify what they want, either the system does what they specified or it does nothing. And they don't need to, that there's like this black box of abstraction which users don't need to reason past, and they can use the system safely at this level of abstraction. Often you have technological systems where the user is kind of doing something that is a bit more imperative, like they're signing a transaction which does a particular call in the EVM on Ethereum or something. And that, unfortunately, it just doesn't map very cleanly to the user's understanding of what is going on with the system. Like they wanted to do a trade, right? Why are they signing this sort of bytecode instructions? That has nothing to do with what they want. And it's easy when you have that kind of discrepancy to make mistakes, basically, in what you're like effectively authorizing the system to do and what you wanted to authorize the system to do. So intent-centric design is a kind of explicit assumption of this dual perspective to try and close that gap. Then also in that word salad of a tagline that we have, I suppose, but you find privacy preserving, which just means that we want to, privacy is sometimes contrasted to like, there are private systems and then there are transparent systems. And in private systems, everything is private, and transparent systems, everything is public. And this is just really a false dichotomy. Privacy means consent. Privacy does not mean that all of the information is like never available. That would be useless. I mean, who wants to use a system where you never know anything? It's like, yeah, that's something else. But privacy to us means simply that users always have the choice of which data they disclose to whom, and that the system doesn't require that they disclose any more data than is required in the context of like the interaction in question. So if I pay you, I mean, you're going to learn how much I paid you. Otherwise, there's like no meaning to this interaction, right? So it's not private to you, but it's private to everybody else because no one else needs to learn. We can verify that the payment was valid or the trade was valid without anyone else learning more details than that it was valid, right? So we have this kind of separation between the entities involved in the interaction and the entities outside of it. And we just try and ensure that, unless the user explicitly elects to disclose some data, it's not disclosed sort of implicitly or without their consent. But yeah, counterparty discovery and settlement, I touched upon a little bit earlier, but counterparty discovery is the process of finding someone with whom you want to interact. So let's say that we're implementing a kind of decentralized ride sharing application, right? So there are some, in a particular geographical area, there are some drivers with cars who are interested in picking up paying customers. There are some customers who are interested in going to different places. These entities or these people want to discover each other like pretty much programmatically. I mean, there are probably some, trust scores or ratings built into the system. There is very critical human input into the system. But at the sort of time of action, a user like wants a car like in the next 5 minutes, and the driver wants, most revenue within a day, stuff like this. You have pretty metrics that these parties can use to discover each other. But at the moment, that counterparty discovery is typically performed by sending all of everyone's data to like some Uber server in San Francisco, Sacramento, California data center. Then the server does the counterparty discovery, figures out which drivers should go with which riders, and sends them back. But with Anoma, we've crafted a decentralized architecture for this counterparty discovery. So where there's what we call an intent gossip network, where these intents, such as wanting a ride and having a car, are gossiped around between different parties, specialized parties called solvers, and then they're settled in transactions. So in Anoma land, instead of sending your data to some server in Sacramento, California, just like maybe some of the drivers would be running solvers, and you would gossip around your data in a kind of very local gossip network. So you don't even need the internet necessarily. I mean, you could be using TCP/IP, but your data never needs to leave the area in which the actors who you care about like discovering and settling with actually reside, right? So if you're trying to find a car in sort of Portland, Oregon, you don't ever need to leave the network of Portland, Oregon, which seems like it should be an easy property in principle, but in practice, this doesn't happen very much at the moment because everything is like reliant on these centralized data centers. So we've crafted just the kind of architecture to enable peer-to-peer or decentralized counterparty discovery, in addition to settlement, which is the more typical thing that blockchains do already. But we think it's essential to do both, because if you have, adversaries are kind of be they, hacker adversaries or economic adversaries or something else, are going to go after the weakest link in your system. And even if you have kind of censorship resistant or decentralized settlement on a blockchain or distributed ledger of some sort, the weakest link in most applications just moves to counterparty discovery. And if your counterparty discovery is happening on one server, then any adversary is going to go after that. So we want to kind of solve the more holistic problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it really does. Thanks for demystifying a lot of that. And I think it is such an important topic right now, because as we begin 2023, many are increasingly talking about the risks and lack of privacy of heading into a cashless world. And some people listening will be shouting loudly the risks of sleepwalking into a cashless world, while others will arguably foolishly say it's convenient and I've got nothing to hide. So just to set the scene for our conversation today, can you talk a little about why anonymity is so important when it comes to money?
Right. I mean, it's interesting that we've ended up in this sort of social equilibrium, because if you zoom out, it's really quite atypical.
Yeah.
As in sort of individual privacy was the norm for basically all of human history except the last 20 years. And sometimes surveillance has become culturally normalized in ways that I think are kind of
Yeah.
very concerning, and also often the result of explicit or implicit propaganda, as in it's not, the discourse is not fair, particularly between various parties involved, and corporations and governments have a lot of vested interest in additional control over the network. Why is financial privacy important? Financial privacy is important because the financial systems are kind of the medium through which we transmit control over resources, right? Or control over kind of the fruits of labor. And that is really critical. I mean, for example, for anyone organizing a group effort, organizing a protest, organizing a labor action, organizing anything, any kind of group needs resources just to sustain itself. And if one group has single-handed control over the financial system, if they can see everything and like censor things, then they have a really asymmetric lever over other groups. So we've already seen, I mean, some governments claim that they have due process in place to prevent this, but that's unfortunately that argument just doesn't hold up in practice. Human systems are not that capture resistant, and you can see this already. The Canadian government, which is not certainly before this incident, was not the government I would have guessed to like turn authoritarian so quickly, but it did. The Canadian government tried to, and for a while at least, shut down bank accounts of people who had donated, not even who were protesting, but who had donated to protesters in a labor action by some truckers in Canada about a year ago, which is just nuts. I mean, nuts. And also in Brazil, I think the government has taken action to freeze bank accounts of people who were supporting the protests. So, the privacy does not remove the ability of like law enforcement to do anything. It just seeks a more sort of reasonable equilibrium between competing tensions here, right? So, in a world where most transactions are private, which is like the world before 20 years ago, there will be still be judges and court warrants, and there will still be investigations of specific kinds of crimes, stuff like this. None of that's going to go away. It's just not. It won't be so cheap anymore to do this kind of dragnet surveillance. What we have right now is like dragnet surveillance, where it's basically free for the government or large corporations, which tend to adopt the same power structures anyway, to selectively censor, to scan everything, to kind of like it's very cheap for them to do all of these things, and they have all the data kind of by default. They don't have to specifically go get it; they just already have it, and that just proves way too tempting for corporations, for governments. It's not the basis of kind of a reasonable equilibrium of the social. So bringing privacy back into transactions is a way of bringing that equilibrium back to one that seems, from the perspective of protection of civil liberties, just more reasonable. And it doesn't prevent any kind of like users can still disclose things, communities can still decide that they want like social rules that say that certain information should be disclosed. Privacy in systems design doesn't change. It doesn't like mandate that the community chooses X. It just gives people the kind of technological substrate to make those choices freely, instead of having them sort of forced on them just by virtue of using this. Yeah. I would also say, I mean, there's this like, unfortunately, so far, the blockchain industry has not at all contributed to a better financial privacy for people, except with the exception of very specific projects such as Zcash. But transparent blockchains are a privacy nightmare. They're much worse than using a bank because your information is disclosed to everybody and everybody can use it to censor you. And the cost of querying it is zero. So please be careful when you use transparent blockchains, because that data is never going away.
Yeah, and you used some great examples there of what was happening in Canada and Brazil and all across the world. There was so much polarization and division, and the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And over here in the UK, they're talking about a public order bill, which many are seeing as an attack on the right to protest. So you've got protests, again, could be looking at being illegal, or ways of shutting down bank accounts, like you've mentioned. You've provided several examples. So it's certainly a topic we need to explore. And just because you're on one particular side of the political spectrum today, it doesn't mean you're going to be on the right side tomorrow. And I think it's something we should all unite on and talk about more. So can you tell me a bit more about why privacy as a public good enabled by blockchain is so important?
The reason we kind of like to use this conceptual frame is that it illuminates a bit of the nature of what privacy is. So often in economics, there are what we call private goods, which are like food, like goods that one person can have or another person can have, but they can't both have. So if you have one piece, one burger, I mean, you and I could split the burger and each eat half, but in total, there's only one burger. We can't like copy it for free or something like this.
Yeah.
But privacy is different. So if you are using a system that provides some privacy, and I'm using the same system that provides some privacy, by virtue of both of us using the system, we both have more privacy. So it's like privacy is not scarce. Privacy is abundant. the more people that use a private system, the more privacy people get. It's really great in that way. But it also means that it's important to design economic systems that take that into account. In particular, often there's sort of privacy doesn't come, it doesn't come without a cost. There's some like additional settlement cost to use these cryptographic techniques such as zero knowledge proofs to settle transactions. And often users are, probably doing a transaction where maybe the privacy of that individual transaction is just not the most valuable thing to them. Like they're buying coffee. Am I going to get censored for buying coffee? I mean, maybe at some point, still think it's good for that transaction to be private, but not yet. I could understand if people aren't yet so concerned about these things, right? So if private transactions are more expensive, then they just might not do private transactions when they buy, simple stuff like coffee, or just in sort of many of these everyday cases. They might only do private transactions when they're really worried about their privacy. But if people only do private transactions when they're really worried about their privacy, then you have two problems. One, there are just many fewer private transactions because people aren't doing them in like regular scenarios. They're only doing them in specific ones. So the total amount of privacy everybody has is lower. And two, if you only do private transactions in situations when you want privacy, then doing a private transaction itself becomes suspicious, right? Like then, someone could just look at the network and say, oh, you did a private transaction. Maybe they don't know what the transaction was because it was private, but they might like use that metadata alone to go like try and search more, right? So it's important for the anonymity set, or the privacy set, to be as big as possible. And in particular, what we do in Anoma is to give incentives for people to do private transactions, even when like in the moment, they might not care. Because in, privately transacting when you buy coffee, even if you don't care about the privacy, even if it's not kind of like a good privately or specifically to you, it's a good to other people because you're creating more privacy for them. So we have this kind of like subsidy system where if users keep their assets in what we call the shielded pool, so they keep their assets private and keep transacting privately, they earn some rewards over time. So the system the economic system pays some of the Anoma token to users just for providing privacy, with the idea that this will sort of nudge people in the direction of, even when they don't personally care in a specific interaction, transacting in a private way, which provides more privacy to everybody else.
And to further demystify this space, can I also ask you to talk a little about the state of security across chain bridges and why the industry actually needs better solutions right now?
It's interesting that sometimes I think the blockchain industry treats itself, or entities within the industry treat themselves as operating in sort of a startup product experimental space, where there are different products and you can kind of try them and see if they work or not. And there's not a clear solution except as validated by them. And in some senses, that's true. I mean, that's ultimately true in some sense. Like if no one ever wants to use this technology, maybe there's no reason for it to exist. But on the other hand, there are many specific questions like bridge design that are solidly in the realm of distributed systems problems, like they are a research field, and research fields have constraints. There are things that you can and can't do and security models that you can and can't instantiate, and you can kind of break down what the set of possibilities are. And a lot of bridge designs don't really, I observe here from the outside, so I don't want to critique specific projects, but just a lot of designs that I've seen don't seem to recognize this. Like they kind of they claim to do one thing, but their bridge kind of does another, and it's not clear that they've read or understood the sort of theoretical background, which would allow them to kind of state, what exactly it is they're implementing in the problem space clearly. Because there is one problem space. There's not, there are different options, but there are constraints to all bridge designs. There are sort of, specific security models that you can and can't instantiate, and there's no the distributed systems research literature specifies those constraints pretty clearly. So a lot of projects, I think, believe that they can like find a new product that somehow doesn't have to fit within that theoretical framework, and they're just wrong. That's it's how research works. Like there are kinds of computing systems which are possible, and there are kinds which are impossible. And of course, the research work itself could be a mistake in some of these prior theories. So you have to understand them. But once there's no, it's not like trying a bunch of random experiments is not necessarily going to provide any new answers, right? So I also think that there's a desire to go to market quickly, and that often leads to trade-offs being made, particularly with respect to security, with respect to So they're just deploying systems quickly that haven't been formally verified or audited. And I understand why people want to do that. They're under time pressure. They think they're competing with these other bridge protocols, but it does lead to a loss of technical rigor and often bugs, and then the kind of consequent loss of confidence among users, which is unfortunate. I also think it's unfortunate that at the moment, things are structured in a way that the primary way to raise money for a lot of these projects is by launching a token, and launching a token tends to require that you have your own security zone, but bridging protocols in principle don't need tokens or separate security zones. In fact, those generally make them worse because they add security assumptions and add complexity. So IBC, for example, or there are other ways you could build permissionless bridging protocols that just rely on the underlying validator sets or miners of the chains in question. And I think those are, in general, from a security perspective, much better and will probably end up standing the test of time. But there is this discrepancy between the incentive structure currently perpetuating most projects and the kind of what makes sense from a distributed systems theoretical perspective.
And before you came on the podcast today, I was doing a little research on you. One of the things I was reading was your belief that why an interoperable multi-chain future is essential for the future of DeFi. Can you expand on that for me, for anyone that's not seen that?
Yeah, I guess to me, interoperability is essential because it preserves this kind of dual of some people, in a community want some level of autonomy. They want to craft their own rules and make their own decisions and sort of have some within community rules for how that community operates. But they also want interoperability. They also want to, trade with other communities or, exchange information or mingle or, interact in some ways with other communities and perhaps different ways with their own community. So there's this internal external distinction. And because of the way distributed system consensus works, when you use a blockchain, it's not because sometimes this word trustless is bandied about, but trustless is unfortunately very misleading because blockchains aren't trustless systems. They're systems which make trust explicit, which is a very good thing. The primary challenge with a lot of existing financial infrastructure is that you have absolutely no idea who you're trusting or to do what when you interact with these systems. They're just like amorphous blobs of magic, and they frequently don't do what you want, and no one, not even the Fed, knows why, right? So we just don't understand. It's just evolved complexity and local incentive space optimizations over many, many decades, centuries even. But when you use these sort of from scratch blockchain systems, you're making explicit trust assumptions. You're trusting, a quorum of a set of validators or something like this. And different users are just going to want to make different trust assumptions because they have different communities, because they know different validators, because they don't want to operate by the same rules, right? We shouldn't, we should not strive for one global blockchain or one global validator set. That is, to me, it seems to be dangerous, right? And not reflecting the kind of diversity of culture and the diversity of preference, the diversity even of technical system requirements, right? So, but in order to, if there's sort of many separate systems that don't interoperate, then people kind of have to choose between them. They can't, take a little bit from one and a little bit from the other. And that tends to mean often that people will sort of agglomerate or move just towards one big one because there tend to be large network effects from using these systems that are mediating economic commerce, and you want to be able to interact with as many people as possible. So interoperability kind of smoothens this divide and allows people to choose some rules locally and some ways of interacting with other systems without giving up their local autonomy or sovereignty. And I think that's very important.
100% with you on that. And of course, another big topic right now is how hacker techniques are becoming increasingly sophisticated in the crypto realm. And I'm curious, what are you seeing here? And what do you think can be done to prevent future hacks? Because we're all seeing these hacks on a regular basis and realize from what we've seen last year that things have got to change in 2023. But what do you think can be done differently to prevent future hacks?
Right. Well, I have to say, I'm very thankful for the hackers because I think they're doing a much needed service of illuminating bad systems design and bad programming language design, basically bad theory. And Unfortunately, it's and maybe it can be hard to see this, but unfortunately, most of our existing financial infrastructure is just built on bad theory. Your banks are not secure. They're secure in sort of human sort of ways or average sort of ways. And there are, the government prosecutes people who hack banks and stuff like this, but the system is not really secure. And, you can find many cases where people have managed to break it. And in particular, many cases where nation states or other more actors who are not so afraid of individual prosecutions by agencies, stuff like this, can just break these systems very easily. So they're not really providing a lot of protection. There's this kind of illusion of protection that's generated just by the legal threat, but the systems themselves are not secure. But they can be. That's the thing. That there's no, it brilliantly, like amazingly, cryptography and sort of the structure of the way the irreversibility of time works, at least it seems to at the moment, is such that cryptography is very defense favored. As in, if you and I exchange some kind of private key material, and then we go far across the world, but we still, kept that key material secret, we can communicate securely, and we're pretty sure and have good reason to believe that no spy agency or government or corporation or anyone on Earth can break the security of our communications. So there are these very powerful cryptographic primitives which we can use to construct these kinds of systems. But, the error tends to be in the construction. So the cryptographic primitives are simple and sort of well-defined, and cryptography as a research literature has pretty good languages for reasoning about safety and security and checking these systems. There's a sort of culture of reading through other people's things. Not to say that there aren't mistakes, but it's pretty decent. But where we really are failing at the moment is in composition of these primitives and putting them together into these complex protocol stacks featuring many different users and different validators and bridging to kind of existing, legacy protocols such as TCP/IP, the internet in various ways. And there tend to be a lot of mistakes in that composition. And I think the hackers are really, illuminating a problem that needs to be fixed by grounds up restructuring of how we design and architect and implement these systems in theory, not in practice. In practice is just like you can patch the hacks, right? You can fix the specific problems, but the hackers are a symptom of this like systemic failure to architect systems from a sort of sound theoretical basis and to kind of design things in a way that's sufficiently clear that you like always understand what it is that you want the system to do and can check that the system actually does that. This is possible. It's just very hard. And in a world where, everyone is kind of competing to launch things quickly because of the structure of the incentives and where, where that kind of rigor and, this is a very different thing from web programming, right? You can make your website to make it look pretty and it doesn't matter if it's secure. Like, that's fine. And there's no need. I'm not saying that everything needs to be this way, but there are just like very different roles for different kinds of programming languages and systems. And the role which those languages and systems involved in designing these kind of cryptographic and financial backbone infrastructure systems need to play requires of them a very sound theoretical basis that is not only like crafted in principle, but also followed through in execution and understood by the implementers of these systems. And that, I think that will take a long time, perhaps beyond 2023. But I am optimistic that the hackers doing the service which they continue to do for the industry are continuing to illuminate that we have not solved this problem, and they should keep illuminating that until we do.
And I cannot thank you enough for coming on the podcast today and demystifying this space and also giving everyone an overview of Anoma in a language that everyone can understand. But I'm also conscious we're going to have a few members of your community listening, and they've been patiently listening to all the stuff they know about already, hoping to get a teaser or some kind of hint of what they can expect this year. So are there any teasers you can leave us with around what we can expect from you in 2023?
Sure. Well, this one's not a teaser, but we actually launched the Nomada public testnets this week, just 2 days ago. So if anyone would like to join those, they are public and available, and you can send shielded transactions and do all these nice things. And we just finished the Nomada trusted setup, and we'll be publishing the results of those soon. In 2023, I think we expect a lot of, hopefully a kind of pretty final release of the software. We expect we're releasing a lot of constituent components of Anoma as well, and including demos, including Typhon, Taiga, some of the compiler stacks, a lot of open source infrastructure that people can start to use. And we'll probably be hosting some events, doing some other things. Yeah, more details to come. We try not to commit, to specific dates too far in advance, but the most exciting thing in 2023 will be the launch of Nomada in Q1, at least the most exciting upcoming thing. So awesome. Please stay tuned for that. And if you would like to participate as a validator or as a user, get in touch.
But we're going to need to get you back on the podcast later in the year. But for anyone listening, there's a bit of a tradition on this podcast where I always ask the guests to leave everyone listening with a personal note of inspiration. Now, as we're at the beginning of a new year, where everyone's promised themselves they may be going to read a book or do something differently, teach themselves something. Can you leave us with a book that has inspired you that we can add to our Amazon wish list? If there was one book I was asking you to share, what would that book be and why?
I can. Recently, I've become enamored with the research field of cybernetics.
Yeah.
which I think is a very good lens to view sort of economic systems, blockchain protocols, crypto economics, because it captures not only the kind of internal technical system design of these systems, but also the function which they play to users and how users like approach them as like a mediating feedback system through which they sort of mediate interactions with the world, which is what an economic system is. So I would recommend the seminal text, just as a starter point, by Norbert Wiener, Cybernetics or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, was written in the 1940s, I believe, early 1940s. And it's a beautiful book. It's a book written back from when, I guess before like the incentive structure of peer review completely wrecked scientific language. So it's much more human in some ways. It's both technical and human, and he kind of switches adeptly between those two modes in a way that you just rarely find in scientific writing now. And it's a joy to read.
In that book, anywhere, does it mention the line, "I'm a cybernetic organism, living tissue over metal endoskeleton"? Does it mention that line anywhere?
I don't know. Maybe.
No worries. Well, I'll add that to our Amazon wish list. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, just want to find out more information about anything we talked about today and the work you're doing at Anoma, or even join your community or ask a question, what's the best starting point for everything?
Yeah, you can find us online at anoma.net or nomada.net, and you can find all the social and other links to those pages.
Awesome. Well, I think we covered so much in a short amount of time there, from the need for full decentralization in blockchain, privacy as a good enabled by blockchain, and why anonymity in money is so important. But more than anything, just a big thank you for coming on, sharing that, and also sharing your story. Thank you.
Thank you.
So a big thank you to Chris for joining me on the podcast today, talking about the state of security across cross-chain bridges and why the industry needs better solutions, what can be done to prevent future attacks, how hacker techniques are becoming increasingly sophisticated in the crypto realm, and why interoperable multi-chain future is essential for the DeFi industry. And finally, of course, that need for full decentralization in blockchain. There are a few worrying conversations about making things centralized, which is everything that industry set out to achieve. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything we discussed today. I suspect you've agreed with a few things, you've disagreed with a few things, but I also know that you've got your insights and experiences and expertise. And you can do that by emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just at Neil C. Hughes, and we'll keep this conversation going. But tomorrow, I've got another guest lined up. We'll tackle something completely different, and I cordially invite you to join me again. But a big thank you for listening today, and until next time, don't be a stranger.